Everyone. So today we're going to talk about how to avoid Fortinet stumbling blocks, primarily by adding visibility onto the blind spots. I like to start out the webinars that I present by giving an overview of the depth that we're going to go into, just as a favor to the audience. What we're going to do today is talk primarily about places that we should be monitoring Fortinet equipment that perhaps we're not, how to go through and construct some of the infrastructure to do that in a straightforward and lightweight fashion, and some of the places that we should be monitoring. So if you're looking for how to go through and tune the individual ASICs within your 3700, that's not the depth that we're going into. That's not the webinar that we're talking about today. So with that overview in mind, let's go ahead and start talking about Fortinet. I've been using Fortinet since basically around 2002, when it was the scrappy little upstart, an alternative to NetScreen, which was the other ASIC-based firewall at the time. And what I've seen over the years is that there's been a number of innovations, a number of improvements. I mean, it started out that Fortinet was where you went to get all-in-one for your UTM, that you had antivirus, that you had intrusion prevention. And over time, they grew a lot bigger. They had the big chassis-based firewalls for the data center, which walked away from their core. They did one thing. They did it very well. They were very fast firewalls, but not much else. And it's been really nice to see that they've come back to that all-in-one kind of architecture. With that unified system, the advantage is that there's a single web UI for all the functions there, and they have a nice ecosystem for scalable management and an expanding number of services. In fact, by the time we end this webinar, I wouldn't be surprised if there's another Fortinet product that's been launched. Specifically in this webinar, we're going to talk a little bit about FortiManager and FortiAnalyzer, only because there just isn't time to go through and mention FortiSIM and FortiMail and FortiAP and FortiSwitch and FortiWeb and FortiNAC and all the others out there. And one of the other nice things that I've come to appreciate about Fortinet is that they've got documented best practices, that they even have specific docs just named best practices, building on the cookbooks that they have that NetScreen started publishing first. Everybody here knows, at show of hands, that Ken Z, the head of Fortinet, was originally the head of NetScreen, right? Okay. Now, Fortinets are really nice, but some of the things that make them nice are some of the same things that make them a challenge to work with. There is that complex extended system, the security fabric. And sure enough, in 6.2, they've expanded it even farther. Fortinet makes a little bit of everything. And some of the confusion in that interferes even with the core foundation of it, the FortiGates themselves. FortiGates have some of the features that you'll find on standalone devices. So do I go with the FortiDDoS or do I go with the FortiGate? Do I go with FortiIPS or do I go with the FortiGate? Do I buy the FortiSandbox or go with the threat protection? So that's a bit of a hair puller there. But it's part of the price for the rapid pace of change that Fortinet has. The concepts over time have evolved, so they've got next-gen firewall mode now. And along with that evolution of the concepts and along with the evolution of the capabilities, the configuration also has to change. So FortiManager and FortiAnalyzer, these should be all you need, right? Close. They're frustratingly close to what I'm looking for. FortiManager, of course, is a fantastic, scalable, centralized config, change control, backup system. They've started jumping on the automation bandwagon here to say that this is a way that you can go through and get fat finger proof configuration for large numbers of devices. And given that the typical Fortinet shop has a large number of FortiGates, that means that FortiManager is nicely positioned, with the exception that it doesn't do an in-depth health monitoring. You know, it gives the basics, the CPU, the memory, but when I'm trying to figure out is a particular feature working, FortiManager isn't quite what I'm looking for. So surely FortiAnalyzer, that's got to be it, right? Because FortiAnalyzer's job is to keep track of what these devices are doing. You send your logs to FortiAnalyzer, and it goes through and does some fantastic visualizations. You can create custom reports, and all of those reports are based around traffic and security, not so much around whether the system is actually running in the way that we want it to run. FortiAnalyzer is really good to visualize apps, but not to visualize for ops, if you'll pardon the pun. For both of these, the focus is on policy and traffic, with only limited monitoring. There's almost the idea that HA is going to take care of any failures, right? That's what HA is for. And I look at this and wonder, well, who's going to monitor the monitoring? It's a question of how do we figure out if the connection is going down? So let's go through and start building the concept of monitoring that we want to see from an operational perspective. And there's a couple of different ways to do this. There's a couple places. There are tools out there to do automation like TwoFin, like AlgoSec, that look at the policy, because policy is something that is really easy to abstract, right? It's the standardized concepts. Originally, it was the 5 tuples with next-gen firewalls. Now it's application to application. Originally, it was IP addresses. Now that everybody's moving towards zero trust, it is individual named entity to other known entity. Problem with doing the abstraction and the automation for policy is that that policy has got to be different for every single site. You know, otherwise we wouldn't have policies to configure. Every single site has slightly different business needs. Every single site has slightly different business logic that has to be applied to the traffic coming in and going out. That actually means that policy, even though it's a simple thing, possibly the simplest thing inside FortiGate these days to understand, is one of the hardest things to go through and do some automation or some monitoring around. Besides, everything around policy is already taken care of with FortiAnalyzer. So instead, let's take a look at the settings. If we break the configuration down into policy and settings, settings is everything that doesn't affect the data plane. It's everything that is specific to the FortiGate. That's going to be very different on Checkpoint. It's going to be different on Palo Alto. And for that reason, everybody thinks that there's always something a little bit voodoo with the settings. But the cool thing about settings is that they tend to converge around best practices for every single site, for every single location. Granted, the syntax of it is different between FortiGate and Checkpoint and NetScreen, well, not NetScreen's not around anymore, Juniper SRX and Checkpoint. But remember that the typical site running Fortinet has a lot of FortiGates. And that means that when you put in automation to look at your settings and your best practices across all of your sites, you get a good return on investment because it's a straightforward thing to go through, monitor how those devices are working, and have it almost magically work across all of your locations. And the reason that I'm talking about monitoring so much here is because management, in order to be effective these days, really should be closed loop. And by closed loop, what I mean is when I send a request out, when I send commands out to those devices, it's best practice to check those devices and make sure that they are doing what I told them to do. That the monitoring is that back half of the managing part to give us the information to know that we made the right decisions. And the cool thing about Fortinet is that they've got some really rich resources for this. They've got a strong CLI, they've got a REST API. The REST API came out around 5.2, got really strengthened in 5.4. These days in 6.0 and 6.2, it is fairly rich, fairly robust. And of course, there's the CLI, which honestly, can you call yourself a firewall administrator if you don't use the CLI at least a couple times a day? And by going in to do some monitoring with these resources, we're going to discover the why behind the what's it doing. You know, it's kind of funny. I'm in the I heard a story that came out of the FAA, the U.S. Regulation for airplanes, that when they go through and do evaluation of cockpit recordings on black boxes, the most common thing they hear pilots ask is, what's it doing now? That there's so much automation in modern airplanes with the Airbuses and the glass cockpits in the modern Boeings, that sometimes a pilot just has to trust the computers doing the right thing, even though the plane is not doing what the pilot themselves want it to do. Anyhow, Fortinet, unfortunately and surprisingly, does not have a product that does monitoring in a closed loop with management. So here's what this is going to look like. With management, we know we send out the instructions, and FortiManager is really, really good at this. With monitoring, it's information coming back from that device, pulling in the metrics. So we know that the CLI, the REST API are there for it. SNMP can also do this. We'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. So building up this monitoring infrastructure, there is one other change in mindset that I've found I have to talk about with people over the past years. Most of us doing monitoring have a troubleshooting mindset. What's happening right now? Something's broken. Why is it broken? What is it broken? How do I fix it? And the goal is understand the reason and the remediation for the current dysfunction. Now compare that to a lot of the monitoring products out there that are products that most of us tend to ignore over time. Tracking, looking at ongoing stats, watching trends, trying to do projection and planning. So the question is, why is there this emphasis on looking at ongoing trends for devices? And the answer is, it's a lot easier to understand the system when it's not working if you first understand the system when it is working. By setting up a tracking infrastructure, we can speed up the remediation. We can figure out, when was it last working? Was there something that changed at that point in time? And what's actually broken versus what is weird but normal. You know, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands on this one, in part because it's a webinar and I can't see you when you raise your hands, but also because I know that all of us have something weird. So the occasional skeleton in the closet in our network with our device configurations that we don't want to admit to anybody else, at least not without each of us having a beer first. So having that ongoing tracking is going to help us figure out what is weird but normal versus what's actually broken. And then we get the side benefit of predicting trouble. In the short term is something potentially about to break. And in the longer term, when are my devices going to be at the end of their useful life? And when am I going to have to upgrade? So we do the monitoring. One last question we need to ask is push or pull. Polling is asking questions of the device, getting answers back. This is the way that most monitoring works, um, in part because it's scalable, because you can have a central monitoring station that sends requests out to all of these other devices. If you want to upgrade the monitoring, you can do it just at a single spot. If you want to ask additional questions, you can do it from a single location. And then the push uh, paradigm is the opposite one, where the devices being monitored uh, are the ones that send their help, help, I'm in trouble messages out. While this seems a little more efficient, you know, if a device only asks for help when it's actually in trouble, well, that means that there's fewer packets. It means that we're not spending all this time doing these polling statements. There is a difficulty with doing pushes. And for the most part, that's because firewalls and FortiGates aren't exactly friendly to running third-party code in customer scripts, right? So pushes are really good where the device supports it, but for the most part, we're going to have to do polling. So we poll, we can connect in with the CLI or the REST API. My advice to you here is go with where your strength is. If you are very familiar with CLI, if you have a Unix, Linux background, and you understand tools like awk and expect, if you can put together code using Perl or Python, CLI is a really good way to go. If you're looking for something forward-looking, next generation to go with your next generation equipment, REST API is the direction that everything is going. There are some difficulties with the REST API with FortiGate. It is stateful. You have to sign at the beginning. You have to maintain session cookies. For a number of the API calls, it sends CSRF cookies or tokens, which basically means you've got to do a lot of external state tracking. So you really need to have a library to be able to handle a lot of this heavy lifting for you. The good news is that those libraries are posted on the Fortinet Developer Network site. Now, the bad news is the Fortinet Developer Network site is sometimes a little bit hard to get to. So I'm talking about monitoring. Some of you are probably wondering, when's he going to mention SNMP? There's nothing wrong with SNMP intrinsically, other than SNMP is an attempt to be able to pull information out of everything. And therefore, it's almost a joke that the S stands for simple, because setting up an SNMP system is not simple. It takes some specialized skills to set up an SNMP monitoring server. Unfortunately, those skills tend not to overlap with the firewall administrator skills. So you tend to get conversations where the SNMP person says, what do you want me to monitor? Well, what information can you monitor? Well, I can monitor anything that's in the MIB. Well, what's in the MIB? Well, the MIB's got a lot of different metrics. Which ones are important to you? And then you see the conversation just kind of goes nowhere. That's why I like to say, if you'll pardon me for saying so, that SNMP, it seems like it's got a lot of promise, but it's a trap. All right, so here's my suggested architecture. Monitor each FortiGate directly. Monitoring them from a single centralized location, remotely polling, means that you can track the stats for each FortiGate separately. You can aggregate them together if you want to get fancy, if you want to put together a round-robin database, if you want to just dump them into a CSV file that you incorporate into spreadsheets. It's up to you. It's really a question of building up your skill to enhance your existing skill level, right? Use either SSH or REST API based on your comfort level with it. And despite what I said about SNMP, turn SNMP on. I say this because most companies that are large enough to use Fortinets have a dedicated NOC that monitors the SNMP system, or that monitors a number of different devices using SNMP. So if you enable SNMP, at least the traps on your Fortinet, it means that you're going to be building a relationship with that team. And more importantly, that they're going to be able to receive the SNMP traps, the calls for help from your devices, and give you, in some cases, several minutes advance notice of something that's going on, or the scope of something larger that's happening. So one quick note about the REST API. I mentioned the Fortinet Developer Network. It has lots of docs for the API, and it has a number of toolkits. It's got not quite a full SDK, but it's got code samples that are going to make your life a lot easier. But it's behind a registration wall. Not just a registration wall, it is a paywall for most people. Now, there is a way around it if you know some Fortinet employees, and some of you might even be able to just talk your local Fortinet sales and SE reps into helping you out here. But it takes 2 employees by name to be able to get you into the Fortinet Developer Network, which is really the biggest downside with it. And then I can't move forward without talking a little bit about change management. If you are in a large site, chances are you've got change management. We know that FortiManager has some change management built into it. As you go through it and set up this monitoring infrastructure, there's actually only one change you need to make, because most monitoring is not making changes. Most monitoring is read-only, especially if you tie it into a service account that has read-only permissions on the FortiGates. So set up that service account, that is your one change, and then from then on, your monitoring can be retargeted where it needs to be without having to be delayed by the change management architecture. Okay, let's go ahead and dive into some of the details of where Fortinet makes us stumble because we don't quite see where we're going. First off is the speed hump. I love that the English refer to speed bumps as sleeping policemen. It's a little dark, but so this next gen features. If you've taken a look at a data sheet for Fortinet, then what you've probably noticed is it tells you the firewall speed in terms of however many gigabits per second, like 100 gigabits per second. But then it goes through and has a number of other speeds, including what's the IPS speed, what's the SSL inspection speed, what's the next gen firewall speed, etc. Unfortunately, that is the world that we live in these days, that as we have these higher capabilities, they slow us down. What I've seen is the typical slowdown is maybe a quarter of the total established advertised speed, sometimes more. It's going to depend as well on the actual traffic going through your boxes. So if you've looked at the data sheets, you might have seen that it says, quote unquote, enterprise mix. And what that means is that on the Ixia, on the Spirent, on the test equipment that they have in their labs, there is this concept of an enterprise mix. And it's a mix of different packet sizes, different applications, different ports. And that's going to be different from your network. And your network might not even be the same day to day. So you'll see your speeds ebb and flow, get faster, get slower. And unfortunately, that's just the nature of the devices. But if it is causing you high CPU, if it is starting to interfere with the other capabilities of the box, there are things that we can do. So recommendations for this. If you haven't used VDOMs in the past, now's the time to start getting familiar with them. VDOMs can reduce the processing that you have to do. A simple example of this is you have one VDOM that you tie into your northbound interface, your internet-facing interface. And you've got it stripped down as far as it can go so that it's a really simple packet filter doing whitelisting only. And then all the noise that's on the internet, the internet background noise, the scanning that hits you all the time, people trying to find ports that might be open that aren't on your network, all of that just gets dropped. It's stuff that we know is completely pointless. So why even bother doing additional scanning on it? And then once it's passed through that initial VDOM, now you've cut down the amount of traffic that you need to do processing on. And you can do some more in-depth processing without burning a lot of CPU on a lot of useless traffic. So that is one speed hump you can get over. The next one, there is a weakness in the Fortinet architecture, and that is memory. Hopefully you've never run into this. Some of you might have. Conserve mode. Conserve mode is an indication that your Fortinet is running low on memory. There's proxy conserve mode, there's kernel conserve mode based on whether you're running out of user space memory or kernel space memory. And the whole idea with conserve mode is I'm going to shut down some functions because some functioning is better than none. Conserve mode thankfully does have some good documentation in the Fortinet website with a caveat. What it says on the Fortinet website is to avoid going into conserve mode, adjust your configuration in a way that doesn't use as much memory. Turn off whatever features are less important to you. Good advice. But that's as far as it goes, because the final line says, it is up to each site administrator to determine which features are considered important. So I'm going to jump forward and say, here's one that I've considered not important that is fairly useful in terms of avoiding conserve mode. On the FortiGates, there's a feature to do in-memory logging. In-memory logging is nice and fast and stays out of the way, and you don't have to write it down to storage, but it uses memory, hence the name in-memory logging. So one of the things you can do is disable in-memory logging. It uses less memory, and you also have the benefit that it's persistent. If the proverbial trip over the power cord event happens, then your logs don't go away. And there's something that you can pull out and send off to do analysis on in the FortiAnalyzer. And you also avoid conserve mode so that you can still use your antivirus, you can still do the proxy mode, threat analysis, and get all the goodness that we're using the Fortinets to have. Okay. Another problem that we were going to run into in Fortinets is what I call the balancing act. There's a lot of customers that I've talked to over the years that have told me, I paid for 2 firewalls, I want to use them both. Actually, that's the second most frequent thing that I've heard. The most frequent thing that I've heard is, if I'm only using one firewall, then you got to give me the other one for free. Yeah, no, unfortunately, I'm not the one who's historically set the pricing for that. So if I paid for 2 firewalls, why can't I use both? There are ways that we can do this, but they tend to get a little tricky. In fact, if you look in the Fortinet cookbook, there are a couple of recipes on going through and setting up active-active Fortinets with 2, with 3, with even 4. And next to each recipe, you'll notice it says in parentheses, advanced. So why is that considered advanced? Because the state sync between the firewalls when you're in an active standby environment works really well. The changes in the state come out of the active, are sent to the standby, and the standby does the heavy lifting of incorporating those changes into its internal tables. So when you start doing active-active, that means that both sides, both firewall A and firewall B, are doing state sync transmissions and state sync integrations. It's extra load that both of them have to do. And if you're in a situation where the traffic goes in one way and goes out the other, asymmetric routing, then you just hit the worst case scenario. With asymmetric routing, that is one firewall inbound, one firewall outbound. While the concept to someone who doesn't understand how it's set up might be, I'm going to cut the workload in half. In reality, it's doubling the workload because each firewall has to process every session going through. And they have to do it semi-blindfolded, waiting for the state sync updates coming from the other firewall, from the other peer. So instead of doing asymmetric routing, the right way to do this, to be able to get active-active, is going to be, again, using VDOMs. With VDOMs, in this case, the way to do it is, since you've got, I believe there are 10 that come for free, set up a number of VLANs on the inside interfaces, in some way split that traffic, and then set it up so that some of the VDOMs are active on firewall A, and the other VDOMs are active on firewall B, so that you've got active standby for half the traffic and active standby for the other half of the traffic, split out by the virtual domains. It takes a little bit of fiddling to get right, but once you start using it, then you'll start loving it. And once you master that balancing act, now it's time to do the splits. The question that historically comes after, I have 2 firewalls, why can't I use both of them, is I have redundant firewalls, why not redundant ISPs? So this is one of those tricky things that can be done. Historically is really hard to do without having some sessions need to be reestablished. But as long as you're willing to pay that price, then it is super cool to be able to use redundant ISPs at the same time in an active-active. Some of the difficulty is, how do you know when your WAN link has gone down? Well, as if you listen to Alexa's introduction at the beginning, you heard that once upon a time I was doing firewalls at Nokia, and we actually sold firewalls with WAN interfaces on them. So you could buy a Nokia IP440 with a T1 interface, with a T3 interface. But I doubt any of us have set up a CSU, DSU anytime recently. These days, when we've got WAN links that come in, most of the time, the interface to the firewall is just straight up Ethernet. And that means that there's some active piece of equipment between the WAN and the firewall that is doing the conversion and bringing that port up. And if the WAN link goes down, that port is still going to go up. So that is the loss of link light is not sufficient to indicate that the WAN has gone down. The alternative is use some routing protocols. That's assuming that your ISP is willing to peer with you. But even then, routing protocols are relatively slow for indicating that a link is down. Fortunately, there is a solution that's been built into FortiGates, starting with version 6.0, and that's SD-WAN. With SD-WAN, the FortiGates are going through and actively measuring the health of each of the links. And they also have application awareness, one of those next-gen firewall features. So you can go in and configure policies in your Fortinets, or profiles, depending on how you want to do it, that indicate if, for example, I've got VoIP, it's got to have less than this much latency, less than this much jitter, at least this much bandwidth. Or maybe I'm doing a live webinar broadcast. That intelligence is there in the Fortinet so that it will pick which is the appropriate link to use. And if the active link goes down, then it'll fail everything over to the standby. And this can even be done using redundant firewalls. So SD-WAN isn't just for overlays across the internet. That secure SD-WAN is actually a fairly robust set of features that have been packaged together. But the downside with it is you've got to be using FortiOS version 6. And that brings us to the final barrier, which is possibly the largest barrier in dealing with Fortinet, which is Fortinet itself. They put out new versions rapidly. They put out a lot of new features. 6.2 has, they advertise it as having over 250 improvements from 6.0. And even though 6.2 came out 4 months ago, 6.0 is still the recommended version. Well, I should say recommended version in some communities. Most of our customers here at Indeni are still using 5.6. And I get it. You know, your firewall is something that's mission critical. That's what we've been talking about with those past two, those stumbling blocks. Firewalls have got to work. They are the backbone for your company's traffic. Well, not technically, but you know what I mean. And they're also the platform that you've built your security on. But I'm going to ask you to open up your minds a little bit, and at least in your labs, start looking at least 6.0. Because there are some cool features out there that I don't see a lot of people using. SD-WAN is one of them. And I recognize that SD-WAN has a double burden because not only is it a phrase in the Gartner hype cycle, but it's also new to Fortinet, which means that it's got two new flags on it that you have to overcome to be able to bring it in-house and start testing it. But from what I've seen, SD-WAN is one of those rare features that solves more problems than it causes. And because Fortinet is trying to sell it a lot, they've got a number of videos out there. They've got a number of how-tos. There's a good amount of documentation for it. And then there's other features out there like DDoS. With DDoS, I know that there's a FortiDDoS product, but there's also DDoS baked into FortiGate. It doesn't have nearly the same capabilities, but it's worth setting up. Right? If your campus links or your branch links aren't behind a DDoS protected carrier, then having something there is going to be useful in terms of at least keeping that DDoS onslaught on the other side of the firewall. You know, it's good protection, and it should be best practice. So those are the stumbling blocks that we found here. And what we like to do here at Indeni is end the webinars with a couple of resources to get started. Now, I mentioned the Fortinet Developer Network. If that's not something that you can get past, then I was able to find a blog post on packet pushers from about 2 years ago with someone who went through and wrote his own framework, his own Python framework for the REST API for FortiGate, and posted it on GitHub, and it's still there. It's a good read. It talks about the decision process. It talks about his experience. And one of the things I love the most about it is at the end of it, he asked, was it worth it? Yes, absolutely. Did I have to use REST API for this? Most likely not. Which I think is a good indication for the state of REST API these days. It's there, it's available. We don't have to use it, but it's good that there are tools that let us get our feet wet. In this case, the problem that he was trying to solve was he had 100 FortiGates to set up. I think there were 300, actually I don't think he specified what they were, smaller ones. And going through and building this library was able to give him the tools he needed to do the automation to get these things deployed. And then of course, the best tool out there is the one that I keep coming back to. Fortinet's documentation is actually really good compared to a number of the other vendors. I especially recommend the best practices doc, the cookbook, and if you wanted to do some more research into conserve mode, then here's the link to that knowledge base article out there. Thank you so much for attending. It's been an honor and a pleasure, and we will get back to you about how to get the recording for the webinar.
Thank you. And just to conclude, as a next step, depending on your familiarity with Indeni, we invite you to join the tailored learning paths in our community Indeni crowd. Within the community, you can report issues around the network and security devices you manage and can help your peers. Members of the community earn points for their contributions, which they can redeem for exclusive rewards. If you click on the link in the presentation where it says Explore Now, it will take you directly there.